Hello, everybody. Very, very nice to see you all. I'm Erica Fudge, and this is our second British Animal Studies Network um, online gathering for this academic year. And it's really nice to have two people who are talking historically about different ways in which animals and animal studies have impacted from the past onto the present. We're going to have two papers, one after the other, and then I will open this up to questions. As I said, we're only recording Taylin's paper here, so your faces will not necessarily be seen, so don't fret about that. So just to introduce Taylin, if you want to start sharing your screen with us, that would be brilliant. So Taylin Nelson is a doctoral student at Rice University, working under Doctors Betty Joseph and Tim Morton. She's working on sharks and the slave ship ecology found in 18th century natural histories. She completed an MA at King's College London in 18th century studies and working with Christine Kenyon Jones, and a BA at Arizona State University under Ron Brolio. She currently works as a copy editor at SEL, Studies in English Literature 1500 to 1900, and publishes with the BSEX Critics, and you can find her forthcoming publication in Routledge Studies in 18th Century Cultures and Societies series titled Work Animals and Hack Writers in Oliver Goldsmith's Letters. I'm going to hand over to you now, Taylin, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Fantastic. Thank you so much. First, I just really want to thank Dr. Erica Fudge and the organizing teams that helped to have our papers heard here today. The British Animal Studies Network received a lot of really incredible papers, or so I heard. So the team made it possible for us to share our work at what I think is a really critical meeting. The state of the field is an important topic because it takes the temperature of where we have been, where we are now, and importantly, I think points to where we will go. I'm currently in the doctoral program at Rice University in Houston, Texas. And this past year, I had to complete, among other things, a state of the field exam essay, which is what makes this conference perfect for me, not least because I can share the work that I've been doing for the past year in my field, which is 18th century animal studies, but also that I get the opportunity to hear what everyone else has been thinking. So without further ado, I'll get started. All right, so today I'm going to be thinking about 18th century studies and how that the period might be an especially rich place for scholars to address the current and future states of critical animal studies. I will then proceed to think about two burgeoning branches of posthumanism, planetary thinking and ecohumanism, and I will conclude with what these frameworks offer. I will break down what these frameworks offer and will conclude with a close reading of a text written by Indigenous 18th century author Samson Occam to kind of illustrate how those frameworks work in practice. To make a start, the 18th century marked the critical setting for the representation of real animals across genres. The technological advancements of the printing press alongside the height of British and Western colonialism brought a new era of seeing and encountering, which is reflected in the literature of the period. Rod Preece, in his Brute Souls, Happy Beasts and Evolution, the Historical Status of Animals, states that humans have always been the standard by which other animals are measured. Preece's statement is fundamental for the 18th century impetus toward the expansion of knowledge, which both defined the status of animals and reflected the power of humans. The human-animal encounter is essential to understanding the 18th century impetus towards the expansion of knowledge. Laura Brown, importantly and critically, asserts that the literary animal studies is bound up with real animals in ways that can be explicit, implicitly political, or simply assumed. This historical period is especially bound up with the problem of the real animal because animals are newly alive for the literary imagination due to these kind of striking shifts in human-animal contact and awareness that mark this era. So for some examples, Robert Hooke's Micrographia reveals advancements made to the microscope that allowed him to see the microscopic cells of a cork and the microorganisms of fungus, a collection of multifarious bodies theretofore unseen by the human eye. With the invention of the microscope, we realized that things could gaze back at us. One also looks to the voyages of Captain James Cook and botanist Joseph Banks between 1768 and 71 as oriented toward expanding the nation's knowledge of hitherto unknown plants and animals. Likewise, natural historians began to record and classify these findings, presenting them to a broader reading public. Domestication was a natural consequence of such ventures, as encyclopedias, public essays, moral tracts, and natural histories sought to clarify and control the definition and representation of non-humans. Menageries and zoos across London, France, and many other places offered exotic animals to the public as a spectacle, as well as symbols of monarchical power. The commodification of exotic pets as luxury objects furthered this cause. Many viewed the domestication of non-human ecologies as a natural improvement and reflective of their God-given power to have dominion over nature. Indeed, most naturalists in the Enlightenment viewed domestication as progressive. As Roy Porter once said of the period, quote, "The domestication of nature furthered the civilizing process, for wild environments bred wild people." So this concept of animals as newly real belongs to Laura Brown, an 18th century animal studies scholar best known for her book, Homeless Dogs and Melancholy Apes, Humans and Other Animals in the Modern Literary Imagination. And it's also coming from this chapter that she wrote for the Palgrave Handbook on Animals and Literature. So most recently, she asserts that in the 18th century cultural, social, historical milieu, animals are made more materially and newly actual to readers through a range of contemporary documents and discourses. Brown's conception of the real here is useful connection to the ways that 18th century animal studies can open up, quote, "distinctive and powerful avenues of critique that can then lead to an oppositional form of activism." In particular, Brown is leaning into the potential that 18th century literary and historical texts offer for, quote, "thinking about the whole problematic of alterity, whether it's in relationship to race and slavery, whether it's in relationship to gender and sexuality, and whether it's in relationship to animals," end quote. This is precisely where I bring Brown's concept of the real to bear upon what Porter characterizes as the 18th century impetus for domestication of wild non-human ecologies, many of which were by some seen as mechanical, static, or less real representations of what civilized life ought to look like. And in a way that may have been threatening to the burgeoning concept of Western human exceptionalism. So the distinction between human and non-human life was one of the defining questions taken up during the Enlightenment. From Descartes, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant, they all posed the question in one form or another: who is man? What is animal? And what are the distinguishing differences that separate man from animal? For the past 20 years, at least, post-humanist scholars working on the period have published titles clearly invested in discerning such distinctions between humans and non-humans, from borders of human identity, humans and other animals, animal companions, animals and other people, the rise of animals and the descent of man, to most recently Lynn Festa's Fiction Without Humanity, Person, Animal, and Thing. Coincidentally, these contemporary titles also echo phrases that were routinely used by 18th century authors. During the period, the phrase men and other animals can be found in titles by naturalists, anatomists, medical men, theologians, and names such as John Ray, John Woodward, Daniel Tavry, Richard Baxter, and Samuel Collins. Linguistically, the phrase men and other animals becomes not just a popular topic, but also a rhetorical move. The word other negates the possibility of a hierarchy and implies that humans were equally included in the group non-humans and thereby were considered as a type of animal or creature themselves. So furthermore, the ethical question of facing the non-human was taken up in public discourse, famously by Jeremy Bentham, who posed the question of non-human rights. The question is not can they reason nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Bentham here obviates human exceptionalism and purports that the embodied experience is valuable proof of cognition, emotion, and inner life. The ethical matter at hand for Bentham is that if non-humans, such as animals, can suffer, the only reasonable moral obligation that exists is for humans to treat non-humans with justice and care. In other words, Bentham's question of facing the non-human is this encounter of the newly real animal that Brown mentions, clarifying the idea of a being who has meaning by virtue of its concrete being rather than through its belonging to a sort of context or horizon. While all of this may indicate that 18th century thinking lends itself to contemporary scholarship in critical animal studies, it may be more relevant to think about how, despite being known as the Enlightenment, a period that consolidated the exceptional distinction and priority of human reason, was perhaps less settled regarding the human-non-human separation. Despite the more recent turn toward examining the non-human as in need of separation from the humanist point of view, I want to propose today, hopefully not too radically, that these titles of the 18th century and now also ask us to acknowledge the relation shared between humans and non-humans. So this leads me to my second part of my talk, which considers two currently burgeoning branches of posthumanism, planetary thinking and ecohumanism, as viable methodologies for interrogating these distinctions between humans and non-humans. I'll do this by sharing what planetary thinking and ecohumanism comprise, for despite being different theories, they do share a similar goal. What they do differently than posthumanism, and end with a kind of example of planetary thinking from the 18th century that helps us conceptualize how we might conceive of this methodology in our own work. These two frameworks are infused with the problematics of race and its inextricability from planetary thinking, indexing the field's perhaps symptomatic turn toward arguments concerning what it means to live, not just globally, but on a planetary level. We have collectively undergone planetary catastrophes, from COVID-19 and its subsequent variants to rising climate change disasters that impact not just humans, but animals, coral reefs, ice caps, and more non-humans that could possibly be named in this paper. Moreover, as many of us are well aware, the very well-being of the planet is already beyond saving. So as we consider the future of our work and our world, we necessarily take these concerns to task in the histories and literary memories that precede us. In this way, we might ask of the field today, who have been, who are, and who will be implicated in our conceptions of the globe, the world, the planet. So in the face of impending planetary and species demise, Betty Joseph asserts that historical periods like the 18th century already show what differentiated histories might be possible. Joseph clarifies the 18th century as a period no longer just defined by timescales, but also by geospatial renderings, as the age of the world becoming pictured. Instead of giving in to impulses to, quote, hurry to create yet another world with humanity as a natural entity, Joseph suggests that we might, quote, stay with the trouble, to borrow Donna Haraway's phrase, of the 18th century, as a site that already concerns itself with a multiplicity of histories, genres, voices, and worlds in paradox. In other words, Joseph asks us to not turn away from the contradictions inherent within the Enlightenment, and instead read such contradictions and disparities as generative. To stay with the Enlightenment worlds and all of the troubles that staying might entail is a critical stance similar to the ones proposed within the environmental humanities today. So here I'm thinking of Anna Singh's call for co-constitutive kinships between humans and non-humans in the face of economic and ecological destruction, or perhaps Tim Morton's urge for us to view ecological crisis as a way of providing new perspectives on life as interconnected rather than siloed. A phrase inspired by Mary Louise Pratt's recent book, Planetary Longings, planetary thinking, for me, posits that the end of the 20th century marked a turning point in the human and planetary condition. Examining the sources and forces of modernity, neoliberalism, coloniality, and indigeneity, Pratt reflects on the crisis of futurity that accompanies the millennial turn concerning environmental disaster and the new forms of thinking it has catalyzed. Pratt calls for the decentering of modernity's self-centered grand narratives, particularly through imagined and reparative planetary futures broadly defined. Animal studies scholars of the present and future planet must stay with the trouble of Western Enlightenment. This means that we must embody the imaginative perspectives proposed during this period and take cues from indigenous voices and praxis that offer insight into the problematics of a planet in crisis. For centuries, indigenous scholars, peoples, and histories have led the way in imagining and constructing a future world in which we are all planetary subjects, an imperative that this paper hopes to make even more tangible. Ecohumanism has similar goals to Pratt's planetary thinking. Foremost scholar in ecohumanism studies, Hubert Zapf, writes that ecohumanism as a movement ought to, quote, address the failures in society, which are not the fault of our present, of our knowledge, our ethics, or even our politics, but failures of presence, of personal connection with the all planetary systems. This mode of thinking offers scholars the opportunity to kind of sit with the potentials and paradoxes of a non-anthropocentric humanism. While it may seem tautological, it is in line with planetary thinking as a call to reconsider humanism from new standpoints, and I think pairs nicely with Joseph's earlier call to resist that impulse to create new worlds. While posthumanism has philosophically reigned for the past 30-odd years as a key methodology in eco-criticism, ecohumanism has recently come to the fore as a critical way to reconceive of the future of environmental humanities. Ecohumanism achieves this most readily, I think, in its accessibility for the public. Whether meaning to or not, posthumanist scholars of the past have fallen prey to the assumption that human problems are solved, so to speak. Though I will say that there are many posthumanists who are actively anti-racist, intersectional feminists invested in the well-being of humans as well as non-humans. However, concerning the presumption that humans have entered a post-human stage of life and are thus all currently treated equally, Alexander G. Wahilier warns posthuman scholars to avoid thinking that we can now exclusively attend to non-human lives. Wahilier clarifies the importance of acknowledging how posthumanism and animal studies, quote, isomorphically yoke humanity to the limited possessive individualism of man. These discourses, writes Wahilier, also presume that we have now entered a stage in human development where all subjects have been granted equal access to Western humanity, and that this is indeed what we all want to overcome. It is remarkable, for instance, how the not so dreaded comparison between human and animal slavery is brandished about in the field of animal studies, and how Black liberation struggles serve as both the positive and the negative foil for making a case for the sentience and therefore emancipation of non-human beings. There's much criticism against those who brandish their cause without acknowledging the current inequalities that still exist. Posthumanism risks repeating the oversights of deep ecology, which often become dehumanizing, sometimes consciously and sometimes not. But human inequality is enormous still, and the suffering is in no way distributed equally. If scholars are truly invested in finding a way to think about critical race studies, decolonization, and animal studies in productive, non-reductive ways, I will hope to assert today that they should embrace a kind of planetary ecohumanism. Furthermore, ecohumanism is relevant to 18th century studies and the humanities more largely. I will not claim that the humanities arrived fully formed in our period, but it's worth saying that the goal of the humanities, defining man or human, is a question inextricable from the period and, importantly, from critical animal studies. Scholars like Pratt or Zapf encourage us to resist the temptation for, quote, reductionist generalizations about humanism as a denigratory concept, and instead to inquire about its historical blind spots, co-constitutively as we acknowledge the indispensable legacy of knowledge, values, democracy, and of commonly shared practices in ethics and human rights. Perhaps then, within a call for a nuanced response to posthumanism's more dystopian, utopian bent, is a suggestion that we return to the historical context and texts for a generative understanding of the field's future. For in Jeremy Bentham's question, can they suffer, is not the human implied within its context, not just the human's relation to the animal in pain, but also our own consideration of human pain and our relation to others, human and non-human alike. For as Emmanuel Levinas points out, the facing opposition par excellence can only be seen as a moral summons. If we want a more moral posthumanism, I found Zapf's ecohumanism and Pratt's advice to turn to indigenous scholars and texts as critical toward creating an opening for planetary thinking. So as I transition to my last section, I will share the words of Maori scholar Alice Tipunga Somerville, who clarifies the connection for me between indigeneity, planetary thinking, and the legacies of the British Enlightenment. She writes that we do and don't live in Cook's world today. Somerville means that in some ways, 18th century scholars are restricted by the legacies of British imperialism. And at times, the work of extricating indigenous voices from imperial texts can appear seemingly impossible. At the same time, Somerville expresses hope that we are entering a larger and wider view of the planet, perhaps one that will allow for a literary study that reflects the diversity of experiences in history and maybe even helps us to better consider the social, biological, and cultural complexities that this planet has gone through. So I'll just bring today's talk to a close by sharing how planetary thinking is both present within my period and also not just about human well-being, but the well-being of all life forms as planetary subjects. So I'm going to share a text selection from Mohegan author, preacher, and judge Samson Occam, written as a legal document on his tribe's behalf circa 1785. Speaking for the Montaukett tribe in the address to the great men ruling in the state of New York, Occam writes an appeal to local governing bodies in what can only be described as a call for a kind of planetary justice, to share land equitably, to care for its non-human inhabitants, and to face their own shared pasts together, to stay with those troubles, if you will. So I know this is a big quote, but I'm just gonna read it real quickly for you. So we are very glad and rejoice with you that you have at last got your freedom of liberty and independence from under the heavy and galling yoke of your late king. We humbly entreat your condescension and patience to hear us a little concerning ourselves. The great and good spirit above saw fit in his good pleasure to plant our forefathers in this great wilderness. But when and how none knows but himself, and he that works all things according to his own mind, saw it good to give us this great continent, and he filled this Indian world. with variety and a prodigious number of four-footed beasts, fowl without number, and fish of all kinds, great and small, filled our seas, rivers, brooks, and ponds everywhere. But your forefathers came with all the learning, knowledge, and understanding that was necessary for mankind to make them happy. And they knew the goodness of our land, and they soon began to settle and cultivate the land. Some they bought almost for nothing, and we suppose they took a great deal without purchase. And our fathers, they imagined they should always live by hunting, fishing, and fowling, and gathering wild fruits. But alas, at this stage of the world, we find and plainly see by sad experience that we are undone for this life, for all our hunting, fowling, and fishing is now almost gone, and our wild fruit is gone. What little there is left, the English would engross to take all themselves. So here, Occam citing the desertification of resources on Mohegan properties. Occam goes on to declare, quote, our wood is gone, and the English forbid us of getting any, where there is some in their claim, and if our hogs happen to root a little, the English will make us pay damages. Pray, most noble gentlemen, consider our miserable case, and for God's sake, help us, end quote. Such documentation of biodiversity, creaturely rights, and pleas for environmental justice are remarkable. Of course, Occam's account offers an avenue toward better understanding 18th century relations between American, British, and Native American peoples. But most especially, his words here account for a planetary claim for the entanglement of life forms in early modern America, whereby the Mohegans do not wish to keep the English out, but instead to find an equitable and ecological way to share the land and its inhabitants with each other, despite the previous mistakes made between their respective ancestors. And in spite of those past problems that present seemingly insurmountable hurdles toward working together in the present and future, Occam importantly signs off his letter with what I read as primarily ecological planetary thinking, quote, concerning us. This sign-off rightly points to what Pratt would have us consider in facing our present and future worlds. As Pratt states, indigeneity today has become a planetary discourse affirming and demanding the freedom to remain in place, to be placed, to be entitled to remain, entitled not to be compelled by some external agent to move. In the face of a future filled with human and non-human destructions, will we sign off concerning us? So in closing, long before serious scientific recognition of climate change, human interaction with the environment was already destabilizing concepts of the human. During the 18th century, land, natural materials, animals, and human lives came to be thought of in terms of property. And the exploitation of not only nature, but of both non-human lives, such as animals, and dehumanized lives, people of color, women, the disabled, and impoverished, became central to the definition of the human being. The human came to be defined by the exploitation of either the human or the less than human. And it is upon this violent foundation that understandings of the human rest. So it is my research imperative to consider the 18th century impetus to define life by redefining it in imaginative ways that do not make the mistakes of the Enlightenment, but rather think about a future world in which we can all be considered what Gayatri Spivak calls planetary subjects. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. That was a great start to our session. I have remembered